Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I want to fix this. There we go. Let's be honest. How many times have you said to someone, we should totally get together? And you've been pretty sure that you're not going to be getting together with this person anytime soon. Or agreed to a plan, a dinner, a meeting, a phone call, only to not call back, cancel at the last minute, or just drop it. Not because you're dishonest, but because you're tired, you're overwhelmed, or you're just human. Most of the time, it doesn't feel like a big deal. These are the rhythms of modern life, a little flexibility, a little forgetfulness. We're all so busy, right? No harm done. But I've been wondering, what's the cumulative effect of all of these soft commitments and half-kept promises? As we turn to this week's Parsha, the contrast is pretty stark. We read, God is not human and therefore capricious, or mortal and therefore changing their mind. Would God speak and not act, promise and not fulfill? These are the words of Balaam, a prophet for hire, or prophet for profit, if you will, summoned to curse Bnei Israel on behalf of King Balak. It's a wild story. He's hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse Bnei Israel. At first, Balaam resists, then he agrees, then his donkey speaks, and he finally arrives at the mountaintop ready to curse, and instead he blesses, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each time Balak becomes more furious, and each time Balaam refuses to say anything other than the truth. That's the moment we find him in when he says, I have received blessing, and I cannot reverse it. He doesn't do what he was paid to do. Instead, he tells the truth of what he sees. Matovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. How beautiful are your tents, your dwelling places. There's something powerful happening here. Balaam's words are true, but they're also inconvenient. He's standing before a king who is paying him to lie, and he speaks blessing. Now, this is moral strength coming from someone who is not the most obvious moral leader in the Torah. But how much of this is Balaam's choice, and how much is it just God putting divine words in his mouth? The rabbis wrestle with this. In Bamidbar Rabbah, they note that even when Balaam wants to say something else, God puts a hook in his mouth and directs his speech. But the rabbis of the Talmud observe that Balaam wanted to curse, but he ultimately blessed. In other words, he had power of speech, but it was his moral clarity, or maybe just his awe of what he saw, that stopped him. So we might understand that the answer is both. That Balaam speaks truth because God puts it in his mouth, and also because in that moment, he recognizes something undeniable. Which brings me to that earlier quote. God is not human, Balaam says, and therefore capricious, or mortal, and therefore changing their mind. Would God speak and not act, promise and not fulfill? On its face, this verse describes the enduring truthfulness of God. But I would suggest that it's significant not because of what it says about God, but because of what it says implicitly about us. We who do change our minds. We who do promise and don't fulfill. And yet the text is not quite shaming us, but rather it's inviting us to imagine what it would look like to aspire to that kind of integrity. Jewish tradition teaches that speech is something sacred. We read in Kohelet, "It is better not to make a vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it." This is because, according to rabbinic understanding, vows, promises, and the value of our words were not symbolic, they're sacred. Words were binding, and they don't just bind us to one another, they bind us to our own integrity. And to break a promise was a spiritual rupture in the fabric that holds us together. In Vayikra Rabbah, the Midrash goes further and says that one who doesn't keep their word, it's as if they worshipped idols. Now, this might seem hyperbolic, but it gets at something essential. To break our word casually is to put ourselves at the center. Not truth, not relationship, not community, but ourselves. To treat our own convenience as more sacred than our commitments. And that is a form of self-worship. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not immune from this either. Recently, I mentioned to someone that I'd follow up with them about finding a time to get together and catch up. I meant it in the moment, but the week got ahead of me and I never followed through. It happens, and it felt like not a big deal, but then when I saw them again, I felt a tug. Not guilt exactly, but disappointment. Because I want my words to mean something, and this time it didn't. And it colored how I felt and how I showed up in that relationship. These are small moments, but enough of them strung together, and we start to chip away at trust. Not just between each of us and one another, but between each of us and ourselves. And Judaism knows that sometimes we make promises we can't keep. Not out of malice, but because we spoke too soon, or life changed, or we misjudged what we could do. And so even as our tradition insists that words carry weight, it also offers a balance at the most sacred moment of the year. Kol Nidre. On the holiest night of the year, we begin, it would seem, by walking back our words. We stand in community and recite something that would more accurately be described as a legal formula than a prayer. Kol nidre ve'asarei. Let all the vows I have made and am likely to make, may they be undone, canceled, annulled. In the context of our Parsha, it might seem strange. In the context of our words being binding, seeing a structure in which our words seem like they're not that binding after all. And for centuries, Kol Nidre was highly controversial. Rejected by the Babylonian sages of the 8th and 9th century, the rabbis of the rise of the Reform movement renewed that sentiment. And for a period of time, they voted actually to remove Kol Nidre from the prayer book altogether. They argued that Christians were misinterpreting Kol Nidre as evidence that Jews could not be trusted to keep their word. And Reform leaders of the time, this was the late 1800s, they feared it would reinforce the anti-Semitism they saw in the world. But the thing is, Kol Nidre doesn't exist to give us a loophole. It's not saying our words don't matter, it's saying they matter so much that when we fall short, we need a process for dealing with it. We need a container to name it and to confront it. It's not that our words are meaningless, it's that they are holy. They carry sacred weight, and we need to reckon with that. And once we begin to take that reckoning seriously, once we start paying attention to how much is at stake in what we say and what we do, we begin to see that this isn't personal. It's communal, and it has real-world impact. And we saw this just last week when we saw Congress passing something called a big, beautiful bill. Can you believe it was only last week? A sweeping package that included dramatic cuts to programs that countless Americans rely on: food assistance, healthcare, education. And what made it so disturbing wasn't just the contents of the bill, it was the fact that these cuts were made by politicians who once insisted that they would never touch those programs. Until they did. And it does not seem like this was about changing one's mind in good faith. It does not seem like evolving positions in honest reevaluation. It seems like saying what's expedient in one moment and then abandoning it. It seems like an embrace of the notion that words don't matter. And that's the moment when speech loses its moral power. When it stops being a vessel for truth and becomes a tool for convenience at best, or manipulation at worst. This is not an abstract concept. When words lose meaning, commitments lose credibility. And when that happens over and over again, we don't just lose faith in each other, we lose faith in the very systems that are meant to hold us together. Balaam says, "I have received blessing and I cannot reverse it." To me, he's describing what it means to speak with integrity, to offer words that are not performative or transactional, but true. And if we're being honest, that is often not how we speak, at least not all the time. And when we don't, when promises become mere possibilities, something begins to break. But our tradition teaches that we're never fully stuck. We can rebuild what has been broken. And the season ahead is here to help us do just that. In a few weeks, we will mark Tisha Be-Av, and we'll begin the spiritual journey that leads us towards Elul and up to the Yamim Noraim, a time that asks us not only to reflect, but to return. So let us do the work. In a sea of chaos and disinformation, let us be people whose words matter, who repair what we can, who follow through when it's hard, and begin again when we need to. Let us live in such a way that our words cause blessing rather than a curse, that our promises do not become possibilities, but that possibilities become our promises, that our speech reflects our values, that our commitments build trust, and that our integrity can restore what's been broken. Shabbat Shalom.